The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Beacon Hill, Boston's most exclusive neighborhood. Richard Blackwood stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, his fingers drumming impatiently against the glass as he watched the figure moving slowly across his backyard. The man was bent over the rose bushes, his movements deliberate but frustratingly sluggish. "This is ridiculous," Richard muttered, checking his Rolex for the third time in 5 minutes. The landscaper had been out there for nearly 2 hours, and it looked like he'd barely touched a quarter of the garden. Richard was a man accustomed to efficiency. At 42, he'd built his investment firm from the ground up, turning a modest inheritance into a multi-million-dollar empire through sheer determination and an unforgiving work ethic. Every minute was money. Every delay was a potential loss. He expected the same urgency from everyone around him, his employees, his service providers, and especially the people he paid premium rates to maintain his pristine estate. The landscaper, Miguel, according to the work order, was clearly not meeting those expectations. Richard stormed through his marble-floored hallway, past the original Monet hanging in his foyer, and burst through the French doors onto his back terrace. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, but Richard barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the man kneeling by his prized garden beds. "Excuse me!" Richard's voice cut through the peaceful morning like a blade. "Miguel, is it?" The landscaper looked up slowly, his weathered hands still clutching a small gardening tool. He was perhaps in his 50s, with graying hair beneath a worn baseball cap and deep lines etched around kind brown eyes. When he tried to stand, Richard noticed he favored his left leg heavily, using the nearby fence post for support. "Yes, sir. Miguel Santos." His accent was slight but unmistakable, his voice respectful but tired. "Is there something wrong?" "Wrong?" Richard's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You've been out here for 2 hours, and it looks like you've barely started. I'm paying your company top dollar for efficiency, not this." Miguel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained calm. "I understand your concern, Mr. Blackwood. I'm working as quickly as I can while ensuring the quality of—" "Quality?" Richard interrupted, his voice rising. "I can get quality from any landscaper in Boston. What I'm paying for is speed and professionalism. Do you realize I have a board meeting in 3 hours? I specifically requested that this work be completed before my guests arrive this afternoon." The older man nodded slowly, his grip tightening on the fence post as he fully straightened. Richard noticed the slight grimace that crossed his features, but dismissed it as irrelevant. "I will do my best to finish on time, sir." "Your best isn't good enough." Richard's words came out harsher than he'd intended, but his frustration had been building all morning. "Look at you. You can barely move without stopping to rest. Maybe you should consider that this kind of physical work isn't suitable for someone your age anymore." The words hung in the air like a slap. Miguel's face remained carefully neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Not anger exactly, but a deep weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I'm sorry if my pace isn't satisfactory," Miguel said quietly. "I've been doing this work for many years. I take pride in what I do." "Pride doesn't get my garden finished," Richard snapped. "And at the rate you're going, my wife will be home from her charity luncheon before you've even touched the back beds." Richard began pacing the length of his terrace, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the stone. "Do you know what I do for a living, Miguel? I manage portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Every decision I make affects dozens of families, hundreds of jobs. When I say I need something done by a certain time, it's not a suggestion, it's a requirement." Miguel listened in silence, occasionally shifting his weight from his right foot to his left, though Richard was too absorbed in his tirade to notice the subtle signs of discomfort. "I specifically chose your company because they promised premium service, premium prices for premium results." Richard stopped pacing and turned to face Miguel directly. "What I'm seeing is neither premium nor professional. It's amateur hour." The landscaper's hands had gone still on his tools. "Mr. Blackwood, with respect, good work takes time. Your roses, they need careful attention. The soil preparation, the proper spacing. I don't need a lecture on gardening," Richard cut him off. "I need results, and if you can't provide them, I'll find someone who can." The threat was clear, and both men knew it. Miguel's company had worked hard to build relationships with the wealthy families of Beacon Hill. Losing a client like Richard Blackwood could mean losing other prestigious contracts as well. "Perhaps," Miguel said carefully, "if you could give me until the end of the day." "End of the day?" Richard's voice pitched higher with incredulity. "My guests arrive at 4 o'clock. It's already past 10. You're telling me you need 6 more hours to finish what should have taken 3? Miguel's shoulders sagged slightly. "No, sir. I will work faster." "See that you do." Richard turned on his heel, then paused. "And Miguel, next time your company sends someone out here, make sure they're actually capable of doing the job. I don't have time to babysit employees who should have retired years ago." Richard strode back toward his house, leaving Miguel standing alone among the half-tended flower beds. As he reached for the French doors, he heard the soft scrape of tools resuming their work behind him, but he didn't look back. Inside his home office, Richard tried to focus on the morning's financial reports, but he found himself glancing out the window every few minutes. Miguel was moving marginally faster now, but still with that same careful, methodical pace that grated against Richard's impatience. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife, Catherine. "How's the garden coming along?" "So excited to show it off to the Hendersons today." Richard's jaw clenched. The Hendersons were potential investors in his newest fund, and Catherine had been planning this afternoon gathering for weeks. Everything had to be perfect. The house, the garden, the impression they made. He couldn't afford to have his backyard looking like a construction zone when they arrived. By noon, Richard's patience had evaporated entirely. He'd watched Miguel take what seemed like endless breaks, seen him pause to wipe his brow, observed him moving even more slowly than before. The older man was clearly struggling, and Richard's irritation had transformed into genuine anger. He marched back outside, this time with his phone in hand. "Miguel!" His voice carried across the yard with unmistakable authority. "I need to speak with you now." The landscaper looked up from where he was carefully transplanting a small shrub. Even from a distance, Richard could see the exhaustion etched in his posture. When Miguel tried to stand, he stumbled slightly, catching himself against a nearby tree. "That's it," Richard said as Miguel slowly made his way over. "This is completely unacceptable. I'm calling your supervisor." Miguel's face went pale. "Mr. Blackwood, please. I know I'm moving slowly today, but—" "Slowly?" Richard's voice was ice cold. "You're barely moving at all. I've been watching you from my office, and you spend more time resting than working. This is supposed to be your profession, Miguel. How do you expect to stay in business if this is the level of service you provide?" "Sir, if I could just explain—" "Explain what? That you're too old for this job? That you took on work you can't handle?" Richard was dialing now, his fingers moving rapidly across his phone screen. "I don't want excuses. I want results, and clearly you can't provide them." Miguel's hands trembled slightly as he removed his baseball cap, running his fingers through his graying hair. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand your frustration, but I've been doing this work for 35 years. I know what I'm doing." 35 years of experience means nothing if you can't perform," Richard replied coldly. "Hello?" He'd reached someone at the landscaping company. "This is Richard Blackwood on Beacon Hill. I need to speak with your manager about the worker you sent to my property today." As Richard launched into his complaint, Miguel stood quietly nearby, his cap clutched in his weathered hands. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and beads of sweat had formed on the older man's forehead despite the cool autumn air. "Completely unacceptable level of service," Richard was saying into the phone. "The man can barely walk, let alone do the physical labor I'm paying for. I want him replaced immediately, and I want a significant discount for the time I've wasted today." Miguel's shoulders slumped further with each word. When Richard finally ended the call, the silence between them stretched uncomfortably long. "They're sending someone else," Richard announced, his tone suggesting the matter was settled. "You can gather your tools and go." For a moment, Miguel didn't move. He looked around the partially completed garden, the rose bushes he'd been carefully tending, the soil he'd methodically prepared, the small shrubs he'd positioned with decades of experience guiding his hands. "Mr. Blackwood," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I wasn't trying to cheat you or waste your time. Sometimes things are more complicated than they appear." Richard wasn't interested in hearing more excuses. "Just collect your equipment and leave the property, please. Your replacement will be here within the hour." As Miguel slowly began gathering his tools, Richard felt a mixture of satisfaction and irritation. Satisfaction that he'd finally taken action to solve the problem, and irritation that it had taken half the day to reach this point. He had important work to do, important people to impress, and he couldn't afford to let substandard service providers derail his carefully planned afternoon. He turned to head back inside, already mentally moving on to his next task, when he heard a soft thud behind him. Richard spun around to see Miguel on his knees beside the garden bed, his tools scattered around him. The older man was struggling to stand, his face contorted with pain and effort. "Are you all right?" The question escaped Richard's lips before he could stop it. Miguel looked up, and for the first time that day, Richard saw something beyond polite professionalism in the man's eyes. There was pain there and exhaustion, but also a dignity that Richard hadn't noticed before. "I'm fine," Miguel said, though clearly he wasn't. "Just need a moment." As Richard watched Miguel struggle to his feet, using his tools for support, a strange feeling began to gnaw at the edges of his consciousness. It wasn't quite guilt. He told himself he had every right to expect quality service, but it was something uncomfortable nonetheless. The replacement landscaper would arrive soon, and Richard's afternoon would proceed as planned. His garden would be perfect, his guests would be impressed, and his reputation would remain intact. But as he watched Miguel limping slowly toward the front of the house, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important about this morning's encounter. Something that would change everything he thought he knew about the man he'd just dismissed. 20 minutes after Miguel's departure, a white pickup truck pulled into Richard's circular driveway. A young man in his 20s jumped out, moving with the kind of energy that Richard had expected from the start. This was more like it. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm Jake Morrison from Greenscape Solutions. I'm here to finish the landscaping work." Jake's handshake was firm, his smile confident. "I apologize for the delay with our previous worker. Sometimes the older guys just can't keep up anymore, you know?" Richard nodded approvingly. "Exactly what I was thinking. How long do you estimate this will take?" Jake surveyed the backyard with practiced eyes. 2 hours, max. I can have this wrapped up well before your guests arrive." "Perfect." Richard felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. This was how business should be conducted. Professional, efficient, results-oriented. As Jake unloaded his equipment, Richard returned to his office, finally able to focus on his afternoon preparations. The financial markets were showing promising movement in the tech sector, and he needed to prepare talking points for the Hendersons about his new sustainable energy fund. True to his word, Jake worked with impressive speed. Richard could see him moving briskly around the garden beds, his young legs carrying him efficiently from task to task. No lengthy pauses, no struggling to stand, no obvious signs of fatigue. This was what premium service looked like. Catherine arrived home just as Jake was finishing up, her silver BMW pulling into the driveway with perfect timing. Richard met her at the front door, feeling genuinely pleased for the first time all day. "Darling, how did the garden work go?" Catherine asked, kissing his cheek. She was elegantly dressed in a cream-colored suit, her auburn hair perfectly styled from her charity luncheon. "Much better after I made some necessary adjustments," Richard replied. "The first worker was completely unsuitable, old, slow, unprofessional. I had to call for a replacement." Catherine frowned slightly. "That seems harsh, Richard. Was he really that bad?" "Trust me, it was the right call. Look at the results." Richard gestured toward their backyard where Jake was loading his final tools. The garden beds were indeed immaculate. Every plant perfectly positioned, every edge neatly trimmed, the whole space looking magazine-ready. "It does look beautiful," Catherine admitted, though her expression remained slightly troubled. "I just hope you weren't too hard on the poor man." "I was firm but fair," Richard said, dismissing her concern. "In business, you have to hold people accountable for their performance. It's the only way to maintain standards." Jake approached them, wiping his hands on a clean towel. "All finished, Mr. Blackwood. Everything should be perfect for your gathering this afternoon." Richard walked the perimeter of his property with Jake, inspecting the work. It was undeniably excellent, professional, thorough, exactly what he'd envisioned when he'd hired the company. The rose bushes that Miguel had been working on were now properly spaced and mulched. The new plantings were symmetrically arranged, and every leaf seemed to be in its intended place. "Outstanding work," Richard said, pulling out his checkbook. "This is the level of service I expect. I'll make sure to request you specifically for future projects." Jake's smile flickered slightly. "Actually, Mr. Blackwood, I should mention something about Miguel, the worker from this morning." "What about him?" Richard's pen paused over his checkbook. "Well, it's just that he's usually one of our most reliable guys. Been with the company longer than anyone. My boss was pretty surprised when you called to complain." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "Miguel's got a reputation for quality work. Slower than some of us younger guys, sure, but he really knows his stuff." Richard's jaw tightened. "Speed and knowledge mean nothing if you can't perform the job effectively. I don't have time to accommodate workers who can't keep up with basic expectations." "Right, of course," Jake said quickly, sensing Richard's irritation. "I just thought you should know that Miguel's usually not like that. He must have been having an off day or something." "An off day?" Richard dismissed the phrase as he wrote out Jake's payment. Everyone had off days, but professionals found ways to power through them. They didn't use personal problems as excuses for substandard performance. As Jake packed up his truck and drove away, Richard felt a deep satisfaction. He'd identified a problem, taken decisive action, and achieved the desired result. His garden was perfect, his afternoon would proceed smoothly, and his reputation as someone who demanded excellence remained intact. The Hendersons arrived precisely at 4 o'clock, as Richard had known they would. Thomas Henderson was a methodical man who appreciated punctuality, one of the many reasons Richard respected him as a potential business partner. Richard, Catherine, Thomas greeted them warmly, his wife Eleanor beside him carrying a bottle of expensive wine. "Your home looks absolutely stunning as always. Wait until you see the garden," Catherine said, leading them through the house toward the back terrace. "Richard had some landscaping done today specifically for your visit." The afternoon proceeded exactly as Richard had planned. The Hendersons were impressed with the immaculate grounds. The conversation about the Sustainable Energy Fund went smoothly, and by 6 o'clock, Richard felt confident that he'd secured their investment. As their guests departed, Catherine stood beside Richard on the terrace, surveying their perfect backyard in the golden light of early evening. "It really is beautiful," she said softly. "Although I can't stop thinking about that landscaper from this morning." "Miguel, was it?" Richard sighed. "Catherine, please. The man couldn't do his job. End of story." "I know you did what you thought was best," she said carefully. "It's just that I was talking to Eleanor Henderson about it. Her family has used landscapers for years, and she mentioned something interesting." "What's that?" Richard's tone suggested he wasn't particularly interested in Eleanor Henderson's opinions about landscaping. She said that sometimes the most experienced workers move more slowly because they're being more careful, that rushing through delicate work, like garden preparation, can actually cause more problems later. Catherine paused, watching Richard's profile. She also said that in her experience, the workers who take their time usually produce results that last longer. Richard frowned. Jake's work had been flawless, quick, efficient, professional. Surely that was better than Miguel's sluggish approach, regardless of experience. "The results speak for themselves," he said firmly. "Look at this garden. It's exactly what we needed." Catherine nodded, but Richard noticed she didn't look entirely convinced. As they headed inside, she paused at the French doors. "Richard, did you ever ask Miguel why he was moving slowly? I mean, did you find out if something was wrong?" "I didn't need to ask," Richard replied. "His performance told me everything I needed to know." But as they walked inside, Catherine's questions lingered in Richard's mind like an uncomfortable itch. Had he been too quick to judge? Had there been something he'd missed? He pushed the thoughts away. He was a successful businessman because he made tough decisions based on observable facts. Miguel's performance had been inadequate. He'd addressed the problem, and the outcome had been positive. There was no reason to second-guess himself. Was there? 3 days later, Richard's perfect garden remained pristine, but his peace of mind had begun to erode. Catherine's questions had planted a seed of doubt that grew stronger each time he looked out at his backyard. The immaculate flower beds seemed to mock him, whispering questions he didn't want to answer. It started small, a fleeting image of Miguel's weathered hands gripping the fence post, the memory of exhaustion in the older man's eyes. Richard tried to dismiss these intrusions, focusing instead on his work, his successful meeting with the Hendersons, the new clients who were already calling based on referrals. But the doubts persisted. Thursday morning brought an unexpected visitor. Richard was reviewing quarterly reports when his housekeeper, Maria, knocked on his office door. "Mr. Blackwood, there's a young lady here to see you. She says it's about the landscaping work from Monday." Richard frowned. "I already paid the bill. What could there be to discuss?" "She says her name is Sofia Santos. She seems very upset." Santos. Richard's chest tightened with an uncomfortable recognition. Miguel's last name had been Santos. In his foyer stood a young woman in her early 20s, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her clothes neat, but clearly inexpensive. She held herself with a dignity that reminded Richard uncomfortably of someone, though he couldn't immediately place who. "Mr. Blackwood." Her voice was steady, but Richard could see the tension in her posture. "I'm Sofia Santos. Miguel Santos is my grandfather." The connection hit Richard like a physical blow. This was Miguel's granddaughter, and the resemblance was unmistakable. The same kind brown eyes, the same quiet strength in her bearing. "I see," Richard said carefully. "Is there something I can help you with, Miss Santos?" Sophia's jaw tightened slightly. "I wanted to speak with you about what happened on Monday, about how you treated my grandfather." Richard felt his defenses rising. "Miss Santos, I understand you may be upset, but your grandfather's performance was simply not acceptable. I run a business, and I expect professional standards from service providers. Professional standards? Sophia's voice remained controlled, but Richard could hear the emotion underneath. Mr. Blackwood, do you know anything about my grandfather's background? I know he works for a landscaping company, Richard replied stiffly. Beyond that, his personal life isn't my concern. Sophia studied his face for a long moment, and Richard had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing something he'd rather keep hidden. My grandfather has been a landscaper for 35 years, she said quietly. Before that, he was a mechanical engineer in El Salvador. He had his own firm, employed 12 people, designed irrigation systems for major agricultural projects. Richard shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the conversation he'd expected to have. When civil war broke out in 1989, he lost everything, Sophia continued. His business, his home, most of his family. He came to America with nothing but his work ethic and his determination to build a better life for his children and grandchildren. That's admirable, Richard said, though his voice sounded hollow even to himself. But it doesn't change the fact that he put my mother through nursing school, Sophia interrupted, her voice growing stronger. Put my uncle through college, helped pay for my MIT tuition by working 7 days a week, sometimes 16 hours a day. Do you know what I'm studying at MIT, Mr. Blackwood? Richard shook his head, a growing dread settling in his stomach. Biomedical engineering. I'm in my final year working on prosthetic design. Sophia's eyes never left his face. Specifically, I'm developing better mobility solutions for veterans who've lost limbs in combat. The room seemed to tilt around Richard. Veterans? My grandfather served in the US. Army for 6 years after gaining citizenship, Sophia said, her voice now barely above a whisper. 2 tours in Afghanistan. He earned his citizenship while serving this country, Mr. Blackwood. Earned the right to call himself an American through service and sacrifice. Richard's mouth went dry. I didn't know he was injured by an IED during his second deployment. Lost most of his left leg below the knee. Sophia's words cut through Richard's assumptions like a blade. The prosthetic he wears isn't perfect. Some days are better than others. Monday was a bad day. The memory crashed over Richard with devastating clarity. Miguel favoring his left leg, using the fence post for support, the slight grimace when he stood, the way he'd stumbled when trying to gather his tools. He never complains, Sophia continued, tears now visible in her eyes though her voice remained steady. Never asks for sympathy. Never tells clients about his service or his injury because he doesn't want pity. He just wants to work, to provide for his family, to maintain the dignity he's earned through decades of sacrifice. Richard felt like he was drowning. Miss Santos, I had no idea. You didn't want to know, she said simply. You saw an older man moving slowly, and you decided he was lazy, incompetent. A problem to be solved. The accusation hung in the air between them, and Richard couldn't deny its truth. Do you know what he told me when he came home Monday afternoon? Sophia asked. He said he understood your frustration, that you were probably under pressure, that successful people have high expectations. He didn't blame you, Mr. Blackwood. He blamed himself for not being able to work faster. Richard's chest felt tight, each breath becoming more difficult. Sophia, he's worked for your neighbors, you know. The Weatherbys on Marlborough Street, the Ashfords on Commonwealth. They specifically request him because they know his work is exceptional. They know that when Miguel Santos tends their gardens, everything will be perfect, not just for the day, but for seasons to come. If this story is touching you in some way, comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Every place has its own struggles, and sometimes it's incredible to see how we all connect through such human stories. But more than that, Sophia continued, they treat him with respect. They see him as a person, not just a service provider. They know his story, and they value not just his work, but who he is. Richard sank into a nearby chair, the weight of his actions crushing down on him. What can I do? How can I make this right? How? Sophia studied him for a long moment, and Richard saw something shift in her expression. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps a recognition that he was genuinely struggling with what he'd learned. I don't know if you can, she said honestly. The damage to his pride, to his sense of worth, and that's not easily repaired. Please, Richard said, and he was surprised to hear his own voice break slightly. Tell me how to fix this. Sophia reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is the address where he'll be working tomorrow. Another client who values his experience and doesn't rush him to finish. If you really want to make things right, Maybe you should go see the quality of work he produces when he's treated with dignity." She handed him the paper and turned toward the door, then paused. "Mr. Blackwood, my grandfather taught me that a person's character isn't defined by their mistakes, but by what they do after they realize they've made them." With that, she left Richard alone in his foyer, holding an address that felt like both a lifeline and a judgment. The address led Richard to a modest colonial home in Cambridge, a stark contrast to the mansions of Beacon Hill. The neighborhood was quiet, tree-lined, filled with families who clearly took pride in their homes without needing to display their wealth. Richard sat in his Mercedes for nearly 10 minutes, watching Miguel work in the front yard. The older man moved with the same careful deliberateness that had frustrated Richard 3 days earlier, but now every gesture carried different meaning. Each pause, each moment of rest, each careful step told a story of sacrifice and resilience that Richard had been too blind to see. Miguel was kneeling beside a flower bed, his weathered hands gently coaxing life from the soil. Even from a distance, Richard could see the care and expertise in every movement. This wasn't the work of someone cutting corners or lacking skill. This was artistry, decades of knowledge applied with patience and love. Taking a deep breath, Richard stepped out of his car and walked slowly across the street. Miguel looked up at the sound of approaching footsteps, and Richard saw the exact moment recognition dawned in the older man's eyes. Miguel's expression didn't change dramatically. There was no anger, no accusation, but something guarded settled over his features. "Mr. Blackwood," Miguel said quietly, using his tools to help himself stand. "I didn't expect to see you here. I spoke with your granddaughter yesterday," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sophia," Miguel nodded slowly. "She told me. I asked her not to come see you, but Sophia, she has a strong sense of justice, like her grandmother did." The simple dignity in Miguel's voice made Richard's chest tighten with shame. Here was a man who had served his country, sacrificed his body for American freedom, and Richard had treated him like an inconvenience. "Miguel, I owe you an apology," Richard began, but the older man held up a gentle hand. "Mr. Blackwood, you don't owe me anything. You paid for a service and I didn't meet your expectations. Sometimes that happens in business." The grace in Miguel's response only made Richard feel worse. "No, that's not. I was wrong. Completely wrong. I made assumptions about you without knowing anything about who you are or what you've been through." Miguel studied Richard's face for a long moment. "What exactly did Sophia tell you?" "She told me about your service, about your injury, about how you've supported your family, put your children and grandchildren through school." Richard's voice broke slightly. "She told me about your engineering background, about everything you lost, and everything you've built back up through sheer determination." Miguel was quiet for several minutes, his eyes fixed on the flower bed he'd been tending. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but steady. "I don't tell clients about my personal life because I don't want special treatment. I want to earn respect through my work, not sympathy for my circumstances. And you have earned it," Richard said quickly. "Your work is extraordinary. I was too impatient, too focused on my own schedule to see the quality of what you were doing." Miguel smiled slightly, the first genuine warmth Richard had seen from him. "The roses you rushed me away from on Monday, they needed special care. The soil pH was wrong, and the root systems were more damaged than they appeared. If someone had rushed through that work, you would have lost half those bushes by winter." Richard felt a stab of guilt. "And Jake, the replacement worker? Jake is a good young man, enthusiastic, fast," Miguel said diplomatically, "but he doesn't have the experience to recognize problems that aren't obvious. Time will tell how those plantings hold up." The implications hit Richard immediately. In his rush for quick results, he might have actually compromised the long-term health of his garden. "Miguel," Richard said, struggling to find the right words, "I don't know how to make this right, but I want to try. Will you let me?" Miguel considered this carefully. "What did you have in mind?" "First, I want to pay you for the full day you should have worked on Monday, with a substantial bonus for the disrespect you endured." Richard pulled out his checkbook. "But more than that, I want to understand. I want to learn from you." "Learn what?" "How to see people properly, how to recognize value that isn't immediately obvious, how to be the kind of person who earns respect instead of demanding it." Miguel's expression softened further. "Those are hard lessons, Mr. Blackwood. They don't come from a single conversation." "I know," Richard said, "but I'm hoping you might be willing to teach me, starting with letting me help you with this garden." Miguel raised an eyebrow. "You want to help me work?" "If you'll have me." Richard looked down at his expensive suit and Italian leather shoes. "I know I'm not dressed for it, but I can learn. I want to understand what real craftsmanship looks like." For the first time since their initial meeting, Miguel smiled, really smiled. "Well, you'll ruin those shoes in about 5 minutes, but if you're serious, I'm serious." Miguel handed Richard a small hand spade. "Then let's start with soil preparation. And Mr. Blackwood, this is going to take patience." "I'm learning patience," Richard said, kneeling beside Miguel in the dirt. They worked together for 3 hours. Miguel taught Richard to test soil composition, to recognize signs of plant stress, to understand the delicate balance required for sustainable growth. Every lesson in gardening became a lesson in life. The value of patience, the importance of strong foundations, the way that careful attention to details creates lasting beauty. As the afternoon sun slanted across the small yard, Richard found himself genuinely enjoying the work. His hands were dirty, his knees ached from kneeling, and his expensive clothes were probably ruined, but he felt more grounded than he had in years. "Miguel," he said as they prepared to leave, "would you be willing to come back to my house, to fix whatever damage Jake might have done and to teach me how to properly maintain my garden?" Miguel considered this. "Are you sure you want to hire the slow old man again?" Richard's eyes filled with tears, the first time he'd cried in decades. "I want to hire one of the finest craftsmen I've ever met, a man who served our country with honor and has spent his life building something meaningful. I want to hire Miguel Santos, and I promise you'll never be rushed or disrespected again." Miguel extended his hand and Richard shook it, not as employer to employee, but as one man to another, with mutual respect. "I'd be honored to work with you, Richard," Miguel said, "but I have one condition. Anything. Next time when you see someone struggling, maybe ask if they need help instead of assuming they're not trying hard enough." Richard nodded, understanding that this was about much more than gardening. "I promise." As they parted ways that evening, Richard realized that he'd received far more than he'd given. He'd come seeking to make amends, and had instead found a teacher, a reminder of what real strength looked like, and perhaps even a friend. Sophia had been right. Character wasn't defined by mistakes, but by what you did after recognizing them. And Richard Blackwood was just beginning to understand who he wanted to become. And now that you've reached the end, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Your presence matters, and your story does too.